In the wilderness, silence can be deceiving. The Bitterroot Mountains have always carried their share of secrets. Missing hikers, collapsed cabins, old legends that never found answers. But in 1993, a family vanished from these forests, leaving behind a cabin frozen in time, a rifle hidden in the crawl space, and whispers of betrayal that refused to fade. For a decade, no one knew whether Calder Rourke had murdered his wife and children or whether something darker was at work, something buried deep beneath the soil, in the shadows of Cold War secrecy. What investigators uncovered years later would shake the very foundation of trust and authority, and reveal that monsters don't always come from the wild. Sometimes they were uniforms. The Bitterroot Mountains, straddling the border of Montana and Idaho, were a place of brutal winters and harsh isolation. For most, they were unlivable. For Calder Rourke, they were freedom. He had moved his family into the high timberline with the determination of a man who wanted nothing to do with the outside world. With Alara by his side and 3 children, Maren, Sylvie, and little Jonas, Calder built a cabin that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It wasn't easy, but for years it was theirs. Neighbors, scattered miles apart, described Calder as rugged and capable, a man who lived by his own code. Alara, though more cautious about the isolation, embraced a life for her children's sake. Maren, the eldest at 11, often helped with chores. Sylvie, at 8, was the wild spirit, the one darting between trees, as if the forest itself was her playground. Jonas, the youngest, was quiet and watchful, a child whose big eyes took him more than he said. But in the fall of 1992, something shifted. Jonas grew sick, not with the kind of sickness that came and went, but with something more insidious. He was weak, his skin pale, his small body wasting despite Alara's desperate efforts. Calder, frantic, searched for answers. He tested water from the creek that ran past their cabin, studied the soil in their garden, and even traveled miles into town for medical help, though records later showed he rarely trusted doctors. What gnawed at Calder was the sense that Jonas's illness wasn't natural. The boy's decline didn't match any ordinary disease. Calder grew convinced something had poisoned his son. He spoke of chemical smells near the back acres of their land, of strange residues in the soil. He wrote letters that never reached their destination, warnings to officials that no one answered. For neighbors, the change was stark. Calder's steady demeanor cracked. He muttered about intrusions, about being watched. To some, he seemed paranoid. To others, a father driven mad by grief. Then, in late 1993, silence. The Rourke homestead went quiet. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The family that once greeted the rare traveler vanished. Weeks later, a hunter passing through made a grim discovery. The cabin stood abandoned. Inside, signs of sudden departure lingered. Food left half prepared. Belongings untouched. A stillness that felt unnatural. The most chilling find lay beneath the floorboards. In the crawl space, concealed but preserved by the cold, was the body of Calder Rourke. She had been shot with Calder's hunting rifle. No sign of Calder or the children remained. The rifle, wiped clean, was hidden with her. Authorities pieced together what they could. The prevailing theory was grim but neat. Calder, unhinged by his son's illness and the pressures of isolation, murdered his wife, abducted his children, and vanished into the mountains. Rumors of a murder-suicide spread like wildfire. Search parties combed the ridges and ravines, but the wilderness swallowed all trace of Calder, Maren, Sylvie, and Jonas. For Cassandra Vale, Alara's sister, the loss was unbearable. She never believed Calder capable of killing his family, but her protests were drowned out by the official narrative, the story of a man driven mad by grief. Cassandra became the lone voice demanding answers, clinging to the possibility that the truth was far darker than anyone dared admit. Years passed. The mountains held their silence, until, a decade later, the silence broke. In the spring of 2003, loggers working deep along a forgotten logging road made a discovery that seemed to close the book on the Rourke mystery. At the bottom of a ravine, hidden beneath years of overgrowth, they found the family's truck. Inside were children's clothing, military-grade chemical containers, and traces of Calder's rifle. It was the evidence investigators had been waiting for, the final confirmation of a tragic tale. Calder Rourke had murdered his family, then driven his truck off a cliff in a final act of desperation. The community grieved, but officials moved quickly to close the case. For them, the mystery was solved, but for Detective Rowan Hale, it was only just beginning. The discovery of the truck should have ended the Rourke mystery. That's what the sheriff's department believed when the call came in from the logging crew. For 10 years, the Bitterroot Mountains had kept their secret, and now, at last, the forest seemed to surrender it. The truck lay twisted at the bottom of a steep ravine, its metal frame eaten away by rust, its glass shattered, its wheels half buried in soil and moss. For the loggers, stumbling upon it felt like stepping into a ghost story. The wilderness had preserved it, hiding it from the countless search teams that had scoured the area a decade earlier. Inside, the investigators found what they expected: fragments of families' life frozen in ruin, tattered scraps of children's clothing, a faded hair ribbon, a cracked plastic toy car. The cabin story seemed to continue here in the wreckage, a father driven by despair, ending it all in one violent plunge. More troubling was the discovery of industrial chemical containers scattered within the truck bed. The labels were faded, but the stench was unmistakable. Solvents, compound with names that pointed to military stockpiles rather than farm supply stores. A grim narrative took shape almost instantly. Calder Rourke had poisoned his son through reckless storage of toxic chemicals. Realizing what he had done, he murdered Alara, then drove into the abyss with his children in a final act of guilt and desperation. The sheriff's office prepared a statement. Reporters arrived. Headlines bloomed with the words murder-suicide and tragic accident. For the community, it tied everything neatly together. But for Detective Rowan Hale, standing at the edge of that ravine, something was wrong. He crouched near the lip, studying the terrain. To the untrained eye, the ground was just another stretch of hardened earth, scarred by years of weather. But Hale saw something else: the absence of movement. No grooves of acceleration, no skid marks, no signs of panic braking. For a truck to gain the speed needed for such a plunge, the soil should have remembered it. Instead, the earth whispered a different story. The truck had not launched. It had been still, pushed, at the wreckage itself. The damage told its own tale. Hale had seen enough crash sites to recognize the difference between speed-driven impact and a stage fall. The crumpled patterns were shallow, inconsistent with the kind of velocity needed to break a vehicle apart in free fall. It looked less like a truck that had leapt to its doom and more like one rolled over the edge at low speed. He said nothing at first. Around him, deputies snapped photos, bagged evidence, scribbled notes into damp notepads. To question the find now would be to disrupt the department's sense of closure. After 10 years of unanswered questions, they wanted resolution, not another mystery. But Hale's mind churned. He thought of Alara's body beneath the cabin floor. He thought of the children's clothing in the wreck. And he thought of Calder himself, a man painted as a monster, but one whose every action before Jonas's illness had been that of a devoted father. Something didn't fit. Later, in the evidence lab, the unease only grew. The rifle retrieved from the cabin matched the type of damage described in Alara's killing, but its presence of the truck a decade later was impossible to reconcile. Either Calder had left it behind, or someone had planted it. And the solvents? Hale had served briefly as a military liaison before joining the department. He knew those compounds weren't backyard pesticides. They were controlled substances, the kind that didn't end up in a hunter's truck by accident. The official narrative hardened quickly. Reports leaned heavily into the murder-suicide theory. The sheriff, under pressure from county officials and the press, announced they would close the case pending a final review. It was the story the public wanted. A tragic man, poisoned by his own mistakes, dragging his family into oblivion. But Rowan Hale couldn't accept it. The timing was too perfect, the evidence too convenient. After months of fruitless searching, the truck appeared exactly when public patience was thinning, and inside it lay the precise evidence needed to absolve the unknown contaminators and seal Calder's guilt. Hale knew manipulation when he saw it. That night, alone in his office, he pored over crashed data military solvent registries, and the old witness statements collected in the wake of the disappearance. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. This was no suicide, no tragic accident. This was a stage play, scripted by someone with resources, someone determined to bury the truth. If Calder Rourke was guilty, why plant evidence to prove it? And if he wasn't guilty, where was he now? The Bitterroot Mountains had always been ruthless, swallowing secrets without a trace. But Hale couldn't shake the sense at this time the forest wasn't hiding the truth. Someone else was. And that meant the Rayall killers were still out there. Detective Rowan, Hale wasn't the kind of man to give up once he smelled a lie. He had built his career on details others overlooked. A crooked doorknob in a break-in, a mismatched tire tread, a crash site, the hesitation in a witness's voice when they thought no one was listening. Now, the lie at the center of the Rourke case had a stench too foul to ignore. The solvents found in the wreckage gnawed at him. The labels, faded but still legible, weren't chemicals an off-grid family would have any reason to own. These weren't pesticides from the local feed store or cleaning agents one could buy in bulk. No, these were industrial grade, the kind used in military operations, missile maintenance, and weapons cleaning. He had seen the acronyms before, back in his brief time liaising with Army logistics during the tail end of the Cold War. That was his first break. While the sheriff's department closed the book with relief, Hale opened another one, a binder filled with procurement codes, contractor records, and declassified manuals he'd quietly kept from his Army days. He cross-referenced the solvent batch numbers against government contract lists from the late 80s and early 90s. It was tedious work, made worse by the constant redactions, the black ink that swallowed entire pages. Still, the numbers whispered through the blackout. He found a lead. In 1990, a nearby military base, Fort Drager, an isolated installation tucked into the northern ridges of Montana, had ordered massive quantities of those same solvents. The record showed a disposal contract worth over $3 million. According to the paperwork, the chemicals were shipped off-site for safe disposal at a facility in Colorado. The job was signed off, sealed, and archived. On paper, the trail ended cleanly. But Hale's instincts screamed otherwise. He picked up the phone, calling the disposal facility listed in the contract. The clerk on the other end hesitated, shuffled papers, checked databases. Finally, she admitted there was no record of the shipment ever arriving. No receipts, no logs, no manifests. The entire disposal had vanished into thin air. $3 million. Hundreds of barrels of toxic solvents. Gone. And then Jonas Rourke had fallen sick. Hale leaned back in his chair, the pieces clattering together in his head like bones in a box. Calder's suspicions weren't the ramblings of a paranoid father. The Rourke land sat downstream from one of the mountain drainages that cut across federal land. If waste had been dumped illegally, the toxins could have seeped into the groundwater, poisoning the soil, the creek, and everything the family lived on. Jonas hadn't been dying from some random illness. He had been poisoned, not by his father's recklessness, but by the greed of men in uniform. That meant Calder's discovery wasn't just tragic. It was dangerous. If Calder had stumbled onto an illegal dumping site, if he had confronted those responsible, then everything that followed, Alera's death, the disappearance of the children, the stage truck crash, might have been part of a calculated cover-up. Hale's pulse quickened. He knew what this meant. He wasn't chasing a ghost story about a broken man in the wilderness. He was walking straight into the shadow of a military conspiracy, one with the money, reach, and ruthlessness to kill entire families without hesitation. He needed proof. For weeks, Hale lived in archives and basements. He bribed clerks with coffee and favors, pulled strings with old Army contacts, and sifted through microfilm until his eyes burned. He traced every signature on the disposal contract, every chain of custody log. Again and again, 3 names surfaced like rotten corpses floating to the surface of a lake. Colonel Magnus Drager, the commanding officer at Fort Drager, whose approval authorized the disposal. Major Anton Creel, the logistics officer responsible for drafting the manifests. Captain Darius Kellen, the operations officer who oversaw the actual transport. Their signatures threaded through every fraudulent document. And when Hale dug into their post-service careers, bile rose in his throat. Draeger had retired with honors and now held a cushy defense contract job. Creel had slipped into corporate logistics for a chemical manufacturer. Kellen was still active, climbing ranks with clean commendations in his file. Respected men. Untouchable men. Hale printed everything, building a wall of evidence in his office. Photos, names, maps, timelines. He drew red lines connecting Fort Draeger to the Rourke homestead, from missing solvents to Jonas's illness, from Alara's hidden body to the stage truck crash. It was a web of greed and violence. But he also knew what webs did. They trapped the one who touched them. That night, as he drove home through the dark timber roads, he caught the glint of headlights in his rear-view mirror. A black sedan kept its distance, never overtaking, never falling behind. He turned onto a dirt track to test them. The sedan lingered for 2 more turns before peeling off without lights. He felt the chill of confirmation. Someone was watching him. The next day, Cassandra Vale called. She had been Calder's only ally in the aftermath, the one who never accepted the murder-suicide narrative. Her voice shook when Hale told her what he'd found, but her determination hardened. "I knew it," she whispered. "They killed my sister. They killed those children. You have to finish this." Hale promised her he would, but he knew promises were dangerous currency. Every step closer meant drawing fire from men who had already proven they'd kill without hesitation. The Bitterroot wilderness was no longer just trees and rivers. It was a graveyard of secrets. Hale wasn't just uncovering a family's tragedy anymore. He was kicking the hornet's nest of a military fraud worth millions, and the hornets were already circling. He stared again at the 3 names pinned to his board. Draeger, Creel, Kellen, men whose careers were built on a foundation of embezzlement, poison, and murder. If they had orchestrated the Rourke family's deaths, then the stage crash wasn't an ending. It was a warning, and Hale had just ignored it. The silence of the Bitterroot Mountains could be deceptive. At dawn, when mist clung to the ravines and the pines stood like cathedral pillars, it felt like a place outside of time, immune to human corruption. But Rowan Hale knew better. He had walked crime scenes where serenity masked slaughter. And now he felt that silence tightening, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible. Cassandra Vale always answered her phone. That was how Hale knew something was wrong. For months she had been his quiet lifeline, the one person who believed in his doubts about the Rourke case. Every evening, without fail, she answered his updates, his findings about the solvents, the falsified manifests, the web connecting Draeger, Creel, and Kellen. Cassandra's voice had kept him grounded, her persistence a reminder of what was truly at stake. But now she was gone. It started with 1 missed call, then another by the 3rd unanswered ring. Hale felt his stomach drop. He called again, over and over, until the sun had sunk behind the ridges and the Bitterroot valleys were swallowed by night. Nothing. He drove. Cassandra lived in a modest cabin on the outskirts of a small settlement near the Montana-Idaho border. She had chosen it for solitude, for its distance from the painful memories of her sister Alara and the children. The gravel crunched under Hale's tires as he pulled into her drive. At first, everything looked normal. Smoke from the chimney. Her old Ford parked at an angle in the yard. But the front door hung ajar. His heart pounded. He stepped inside, gun drawn. The scene was chaos. A lamp smashed against the floor. Chairs overturned. Papers scattered like confetti in a storm. Cassandra's favorite mug, the one with chipped glaze and a faded bluebird painted on its side, lay shattered across the hearth. But the worst part was the silence. There was no Cassandra, only the signs of a struggle and the gnawing certainty that she had been taken. Hale called it in, but the local deputies arrived sluggishly, their reports already tinged with resignation. To them, Cassandra was a grieving woman who had spent too many years chasing shadows. Maybe she left on her own. Maybe she had been drinking. Maybe she was unstable. Hale could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe her disappearance was connected to anything larger. But he knew better. This wasn't random. It wasn't opportunistic. Cassandra Vale had been silenced, and the timing was too perfect. Only days earlier, Hale's research had closed on the financial anomalies linking the fraudulent disposal contract to Draeger, Creel, and Kellen. The stage crash, the solvents in the wreckage, the children's clothing, all of it had been calculated to bury the truth. Now Cassandra, the last living witness willing to defy that narrative, had been snatched from her home. The conspiracy wasn't history anymore. It was alive, breathing, and striking back. Hale sat in his office that night. The crime scene photos spread before him. His pen tapped against the edge of his desk, the rhythm erratic, mirroring the storm inside his head. He knew he couldn't play this through official channels anymore. If Draeger and his men still had allies inside the military or local law enforcement, any misstep would tip them off. He began pulling surveillance records. He filed quiet requests for Cassandra's phone logs, her bank activity, her utility usage. He accessed databases he wasn't supposed to touch, leveraging every favor and forgotten password he had. The trail was faint, but it was there. 2 shell corporations. A warehouse rental contract on the outskirts of Anchorage. Security footage showing 2 men fitting Kellen's and Creel's descriptions entering the building late at night. His pulse quickened. They had Cassandra. The decision Hale faced was brutal. Wait for backup and risk losing her, or move fast and risk walking into a death trap. He knew the odds. Draeger's men were trained, armed, and ruthless. They had spent a decade covering their tracks with blood. If Cassandra was leverage, her life expectancy was shrinking by the hour. So he called in only those he trusted, a handful of tactical officers who owed him favors and who had no ties to Fort Draeger. He briefed them in hushed tones. Armed ex-military. Dangerous. Hostage involved. We go in fast. We get her out. No hesitation. The pre-dawn raid unfolded with surgical precision. The team surrounded the warehouse, shadows blending with the steel girders and stacks of shipping containers. The night air was sharp with the smell of oil and rust. Hale's nerves crackled as he gave the signal. The breach was thunder. Explosives shattered the locks. Shouts filled the cavernous space as stun grenades lit the gloom with bursts of white fire. And then came the screams. Cassandra's muffled cries echoed from the back offices. Hale's team swept through the corridors, clearing corners, the beams of their flashlights slicing through dust and shadow. There they were. Major Anton Creel and Captain Darius Kellen stood in the office, Cassandra bound and gagged between them, terror in her eyes. Their weapons glinted in the light. Hale raised his voice, steady but cold. It's over. Let her go. For a moment, the world held still. The only sound was Cassandra's ragged breathing. Then Creel made his move. The room erupted in violence. Gunfire, shouts, the deafening chaos of men who had run out of options. Hale's team surged forward. Cassandra dropped to ground as bullets tore through plaster. The fight was brief but brutal. Kellen went down first, tackled and disarmed. Creel fought longer, desperation fueling his defiance, until he too was subdued, dragged down under the weight of 3 men. When it was over, Cassandra was trembling but alive. Hale cut her bindings, whispering, "You're safe now." But in his gut, he knew that wasn't true, because the mastermind wasn't here. Colonel Magnus Draeger, the man who had authorized the disposal, who had pulled the strings from the beginning, was still free. And Hale knew men like Draeger didn't run. They regrouped. They struck harder. The conspiracy wasn't finished. It had only been wounded. And somewhere in the dark corridors of power, Draeger was already planning his next move. The raid should have felt like a victory. 2 conspirators in custody, Cassandra Vale alive. But Rowan Hale knew better. The silence that followed a gunfight was never peace. It was only the breath before the next strike. Back at the station, Hale stood outside the interrogation room, staring at the 2 men who had haunted his investigation for months. Captain Darius Kellen sat slumped in the corner, defiant but defeated, his lips split and his eyes dark with fury. Across from him, Major Anton Creel paced like a caged wolf, sweat glistening on his temples, his military composure cracking at the edges. Hale had seen men like them before, trained, disciplined, conditioned to resist. But even the hardest soldier had a breaking point. The question was who would reach it first. Inside the room, the air felt thick with tension. Hale set down the evidence files one by one. Photographs of the solvents, Jonas Rourke's medical reports, the Lara's shallow grave, the wreckage of the truck. He didn't speak at first. He let the silence work, the images whispering louder than any words. Finally, he leaned forward. You think this ends with your silence? It doesn't. Draeger isn't here to protect you. He left you holding the bag. And when men like you fall, they don't fall into obscurity. They fall into graves. Kellen smirked through bloodied teeth. You think you know Draeger? You don't know a damn thing. Creel's jaw clenched, his eyes darting to the photographs, then away. His pacing quickened. Hale saw it. The crack forming, the tremor of guilt pressing against years of discipline. He pressed harder. Jonas Rourke was 9 years old. 9. He drank from a poison creek because you signed off on a contract you knew was a lie. You poisoned him. You poisoned them all. How many families have you buried for your bonuses? How many children? Kellen's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of rage. Creel stopped pacing. His shoulders hunched as if the weight of every word pressed down. And then, like a dam breaking, he whispered, "Wasn't supposed to be them." Hale froze. "What did you say?" Creel's voice cracked. "It wasn't supposed to be the Rourkes. They weren't part of it. They were collateral. Just collateral." The room fell into a terrible silence. Collateral. The word echoed in Hale's skull, sharp and merciless. Creel wasn't denying it anymore. He wasn't spinning stories about missing shipments or misplaced manifests. He was confessing, and his confession revealed something darker than Hale had imagined. The Rourkes hadn't been targeted specifically. They had simply been in the wrong place, living downstream of a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. Their suffering wasn't an accident. It was an inconvenience erased with violence. Hale leaned forward, his voice low, cutting. "Then tell me the truth. Tell me what Draeger buried out there." Creel's hands trembled as he sat down. His voice was hoarse, broken. The solvents were just a start. It wasn't about waste. It was about money. Draeger siphoned millions from disposal contracts, reselling the chemicals on the black market. Cleaning agents, fuels, toxins, anything he could move. We were just his hands. The dumping, that was the cheapest way to erase the paper trail. Hale's gut twisted. It wasn't just negligence. It was calculated theft, a corruption so vast it had poisoned not only the land but everything it touched. Creel's eyes flicked to Kellen, then back to Hale. "You don't get it. Draeger isn't just some retired colonel living quietly. He has allies, senators, contractors, men in Washington who owe him favors. You think this ends in a courtroom? No. Draeger isn't afraid of you. He's waiting for you." That night, Hale couldn't sleep. Cassandra Vale sat across him at his kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of untouched coffee. The raid had saved her life, but it had also broken her. She kept replaying the moment Creel and Kellen had bound her, whispering threats in the dark. "They said Draeger still watches everything," she murmured. "That he has eyes even here. Rowan, what if they come back?" Hale wanted to promise her safety, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't lie. Not when the truth was circling closer, tightening like a noose. Because Draeger wasn't just a name on paper anymore. He was a shadow in every corner, the silence in every phone call, the headlights lingering in Hale's rearview mirror. And then came the message. It arrived in an unmarked envelope slipped under his office door. Inside was a single photograph. Hale, standing outside Cassandra's cabin the night she disappeared. The shot was grainy, but unmistakable. On the back, in neat block letters, was a message. "You're trespassing on a battlefield you don't understand. Step back or you'll join them." No signature. No address. No need. It was Draeger. Hale pinned the photo on his evidence board, staring at it until dawn bled through the blinds. Creel's words echoed in his head. Collateral. If Draeger could erase an entire family, what chance did one detective and one grieving woman have? Yet beneath the fear, a fire burned. Hale wasn't just chasing justice anymore. He was chasing survival. For Cassandra, for himself, for the truth that Draeger had tried to bury in poisoned soil. But Hale also knew something else. Men like Draeger never left loose ends. And now, with Creel and Kellen in custody, there was only one move Draeger could make. He would strike back, not with threats, not with warnings, with finality. And when he did, Hale would have to decide how far he was willing to go. Because to bring down Draeger, he couldn't just expose a conspiracy. He would have to become part of it. The Bitterroot wilderness looked different after the photograph arrived. Every tree felt like a sentinel. Every shadow a set of watching eyes. Rowan Hale's instincts had been honed by years of working homicide. But this wasn't just another case. This was war, and Draeger had just declared it. That morning, Hale drove to Cassandra Vale's cabin. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, but the peace of the forest felt like a lie. He knocked gently on her door. She answered with hollow eyes, her hair unkempt, the trauma of her abduction still clinging to her like smoke. "You didn't sleep either," she said softly. "No," Hale admitted. He glanced around, scanning the tree line. "We need to move you. This place isn't safe." Cassandra shook her head. "Nowhere is safe, Rowan. Not if Draeger's watching." Her voice cracked, but there was no hysteria in it. Only resignation. She was right. Draeger had the kind of reach that made witness protection seem like a joke. Hale set his jaw. "Then we make it safe. For now, stay close to me. No detours, no unplanned stops." "Understood." She nodded, clutching a small duffel bag to her chest like a lifeline. They drove toward Missoula, the mountains towering like walls on either side of the highway. Hale checked his mirrors constantly, each vehicle behind him a potential threat. The paranoia gnawed at him, and yet he knew it wasn't paranoia at all. Draeger didn't bluff. At a gas station just outside Hamilton, Hale pulled in. Cassandra waited in the passenger seat while he filled the tank. The early morning sun glared off the hood, making him squint. That was when he noticed the black pickup idling across the lot. Tinted windows. Engine running. Hale's pulse quickened. He replaced the nozzle and climbed back into the car. "Buckle up," he muttered. As he pulled onto the highway, the pickup followed. Not close, but steady, a hunter keeping his prey in sight. Miles passed, the road winding through dense forest. Cassandra gripped the armrest, her knuckles white. "It's them, isn't it?" "Stay calm," Hale said, though his own heart hammered. "We're not going to make it easy for them." He accelerated, the speedometer climbing as the road narrowed. The pickup matched every move. Then another vehicle appeared ahead, a green sedan parked on the shoulder. Hale's gut clenched. A choke point. The sedan's doors opened. Two men stepped out, rifles in hand. "Get down," Hale shouted. Bullets shattered the windshield. Cassandra screamed as glass rained down. Hale swerved hard, tires screeching, and the car fishtailed before regaining grip. He floored the accelerator, veering off onto a logging road. The pickup roared after them, gravel spitting. The chase was chaos. Branches whipping against the windows, dirt spraying, the roar of engines echoing through the trees. Hale gritted his teeth, weaving through tight turns with practiced precision. Then came the sharp pop of a rifle. The rear window exploded. Cassandra ducked, hands over her head. "We're not going to outrun them," Hale muttered. His eyes darted ahead. A narrow bridge spanning a ravine. Timber, old and weathered, barely wide enough for one vehicle. Perfect. He floored it. The car slammed onto the bridge, planks groaning under the weight. The pickup followed, headlights glaring. Halfway across, Hale yanked the wheel sharply. His car scraped the guardrail, sparks flying, but held. The pickup wasn't so lucky. It clipped the railing, with splintering beneath its tires. For a moment it teetered. Then the whole vehicle plunged sideways into the ravine, crashing through branches before slamming into the rocks below in a burst of twisted metal and fire. Cassandra gasped, tears streaking her dirt-streaked face. "Oh, God! Oh, my God!" Hale's hands trembled on the wheel. "It's not over. That was just one." They abandoned the car miles later, hiking through dense underbrush until Hale found an old fire watchtower. It hadn't been used in years, but the door was intact and offered height and visibility, advantages they desperately needed. As night fell, The forest wrapped around them like a dark shroud. Cassandra sat on the floor, knees drawn to her chest. Hale stood at the window, scanning the woods with binoculars. "I can't keep running, Rowan," Cassandra whispered. "I can't live like this." "You won't have to," Hale replied, though the doubt in his voice betrayed him. "We hit back. We take Draeger out of the shadows." "How?" "He has everything. Power, money, soldiers. We're just two people." Hale lowered the binoculars. Two people who know the truth. That's more dangerous to him than an army. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken fear. Then, faint in the distance, came the sound of an engine. Not close, but approaching. Hale's blood ran cold. Draeger hadn't given up. Hours later, as Cassandra finally drifted into a fitful sleep, Hale spread the files across the wooden floor. Creel's confessions circled in his thoughts. It wasn't supposed to be them. The Rourkes weren't targets. They were witnesses, which meant there could be others. Families poisoned, silenced, erased. Hale scribbled notes, piecing together patterns. Disposal contracts, black market shipments, embezzled millions. Draeger wasn't just a murderer. He was a kingpin, and his empire was built on the bones of the innocent. But as Hale connected the dots, one detail chilled him. A series of payments, large sums wired overseas, long after Draeger had officially retired. Not hush money, not bribes. Funding. Funding for what? The answer came when Hale spotted a name buried in the ledgers. Project Winterthorn. It appeared 3 times, always paired with Draeger's signature. No explanation. No official record. Just a code name, ominous, final. Hale stared at it, a knot tightening in his chest. Whatever Winterthorn was, it wasn't over. And if Draeger was still moving money into it, then the conspiracy hadn't ended with the Rourkes. It was still alive. And somewhere out there it was waiting for him. The Bitterroot night was a living thing, full of shifting branches, whispering winds, and the ever-present fear that Draeger's men were just beyond the tree line. Inside the watchtower, Detective Rowan Hale sat hunched over a kerosene lantern, paper spread across the wooden floor like a madman's map. The glow etched lines into his face, deepening the shadows under his eyes. Cassandra Vale sat across from him, silent, staring at the flame. Her body bore the bruises of her abduction, but was her spirit that looked cracked, fragile. "Rowan," she finally whispered, her voice thin. "What if we can't win this? What if Draeger is untouchable?" Hale didn't look up. His pen scratched furiously over the ledger copy he had salvaged. "Everyone bleeds, Cassandra, Draeger included." She shook her head. "You don't understand. This isn't just one man. It's a machine. He's been feeding it for decades." Her words lingered, but Hale forced himself deeper into the numbers. His focus was on the repeated entry, Project Winterthorn. The amounts attached to it were staggering, even by military contracting standards. Millions routed through shell companies in Zurich, Panama, and even Moscow. Not hush money, not payouts, investment. But into what? He flipped another page and froze. Scribbled in Draeger's neat militaristic handwriting were 3 words that tightened his chest. Containment, population, control. By dawn, Hale had pieced together the beginnings of a picture. Winterthorn wasn't just about waste dumping. It was about what was hidden in that waste. Experimental compounds, the kind whispered about in Cold War corridors but never acknowledged in daylight. Neurotoxins, chemical prototypes, substances designed not just to poison land, but to bend or break human biology. Cassandra read over his shoulder, her hands trembling. "You're saying the Rourkes, my family, they didn't just die because they stumbled across some barrels?" Hale's voice was low, grim. They were test subjects. Her knees buckled, and she sank into the chair. Silent tears streaked down her face. "God, Calder, the Lara, the children." Hale reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder, but his touch felt powerless. "Listen to me. Draeger didn't just kill them. He erased them. And if Winterthorn is still receiving funding, that means it didn't end in 1984. It's still active." Cassandra lifted her head, eyes red but burning with fury. "Then we stop it." They left the watchtower that afternoon, hiking down into the valley. Hale guided Cassandra through the forest trails until they reached an old ranger station, abandoned since the 70s. Its roof sagged, windows cracked, but the radio tower still stood, a skeletal figure against the sky. Inside, Hale pried open a rusted lockbox and pulled out a field radio, relic of his early days on the force, when he'd learned where state troopers cached emergency gear. He fiddled with the dials until the static gave way to faint voices. Rowan Hale, detective, badge 4197. I need a secure line to Colonel Briggs at Helena Command. The voice that crackled back wasn't Briggs. It was someone else. Smooth, cold, familiar. Well, Detective Hale, I wonder when you crawl out of your hole. Hale's spine stiffened. Draeger. Cassandra's eyes widened. She covered her mouth to keep from gasping. The voice chuckled. You've been busy, poking where you don't belong. Project Winterthorn is none of your concern. You murdered the Rourkes. You abducted Cassandra. You've been poisoning your own land and selling death like it's surplus lumber. That makes it my concern. Brave words, Draeger replied, calm as ice. But you should ask yourself, detective, who do you think signed your paycheck all these years? Who do you think funded the task forces, the helicopters, the toys you play with? Men like me built your world, and men like me can take it away. The radio hissed, then went dead. Hale slammed his fist into the table, the old wood cracking beneath his knuckles. That night, Cassandra couldn't sleep. She stared at the rafters, Draeger's voice replaying in her mind. Calm, confident, absolute. She sat up suddenly. Rowan. He stirred beside the window, where he'd been keeping watch with his revolver in hand. What if this isn't about hiding Winterthorn at all? What if Draeger wants us to find pieces of it? To know just enough to terrify us? Hale frowned. Why would he? Because fear is control. He doesn't need to kill us if we're already paralyzed. The thought gnawed at him. Maybe she was right. Draeger was too smart to waste bullets when psychological warfare would do. But there was still one advantage Hale had. Cassandra. She was living proof of Draeger's crimes. And she wasn't afraid anymore. Not like before. Her grief was calcifying into resolve. 2 days later, they made their way into Missoula under disguises. Hale in a lumberjack's cap and heavy coat. Cassandra with her hair dyed black and hidden under a scarf. In the university library, Hale found what he was looking for. A stack of declassified DoD reports from the late 70s and early 80s. Buried in the dry bureaucratic language was confirmation. Project Winterthorn had been greenlit under a civilian safety study. The language was vague, but the implications were chilling. It described controlled field dispersals, long-term soil absorption, and unrecorded medical observations. Cassandra's hand tightened on the page. Rowan looked at the dates. He scanned them. His throat went dry. The first dispersal had been logged in 1983, the same year the Rourkes built their cabin. It wasn't coincidence. It was placement. The family hadn't stumbled across Winterthorn. They'd been chosen. As they left the library, Hale noticed a man leaning against a lamppost across the street. Black coat, aviator sunglasses, though the sky was overcast. He wasn't reading the paper he held. He was watching. Cassandra, Hale said quietly, his hand brushing hers. Keep walking. Don't look back. They moved quickly, weaving through the streets until they ducked into an alley. The man followed. Hale's pistol was out before the stranger could reach them. Who sent you? Hale barked. The man raised his hands, calm. Not Draeger. Then who? He slipped something from his coat, not a weapon, but a folder. He tossed it at Hale's feet. If you want Draeger, you'll need this. Hale kicked it open with his boot. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance shots of warehouses, men in uniform loading drums marked with hazard symbols, and a name scrawled in ink, Winterthorn Facility 7. By the time Hale looked up, the man was gone. Cassandra crouched beside the folder, her voice trembling. Rowan, what if Winterthorn isn't just a code name? What if it's a place? Hale swallowed hard. Then that's where we're going. The folder lay heavy in Hale's hands, as if the paper itself carried the weight of bodies. Cassandra Vale hadn't said a word since they left the alley. She sat in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the passing pine trees, her silence as brittle as glass. Hours bled into miles. Dirt roads replaced asphalt, and the world around them grew wilder, more hostile. The Bitterroot Range closed in, mountains rising like silent judges. Facility 7. The words gnawed at Hale's mind. The photographs showed a place hidden deep in the wilderness, far from the public eye. That was Draeger's genius. Hide a monster in plain sight, in the same wilderness Montanans considered their backyard. As dust painted the peaks in bruised purples and reds, Hale pulled the car into a clearing. Ahead, through the trees, a chain-link fence glinted faintly in the dying light. Barbed wire crowned it, a crown of teeth. "Jesus," Cassandra whispered. "It's real." Hale shut off the engine. The silence pressed in. Somewhere an owl called, long and mournful. He checked the revolver at his hip, and the rifle stowed in the back. "We don't have much time. If those guards rotate on the hour, we'll have maybe 10 minutes between patrols." Cassandra touched his arm. Her eyes were wide, but there was steel in them now. "Rowan, what if we find proof? Real proof? Could we finally bring him down?" Hale wanted to say yes. He wanted to give her that hope. Instead, he loaded the rifle in silence. They cut through the fence with wire cutters Hale had swiped from a ranger shed. Each snap of steel felt deafening, but the forest swallowed the sound. They slipped inside, boots crunching softly on gravel. Facility 7 loomed before them. A squat concrete building, its windows dark, its walls stained with decades of weather. No sign, no insignia. Just a door of heavy steel, scarred by rust. Inside, the air was colder, stale with chemicals and rot. Their footsteps echoed down a narrow corridor lined with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, as though the building itself remembered every scream it had swallowed. They passed doors with stenciled numbers. 3, 5, 9, each one locked, each one with small square glass clouded by grime. Hale paused at 12. Inside, under the dim flicker of a bulb, were rows of steel drums stacked to the ceiling. Symbols scrawled across them. A skull, a flame, a biohazard emblem. Cassandra's breath hitched. Those markings, I saw them before, near the Rourke's cabin. Her voice trembled on the name, but she didn't stop. She forced herself to look. They brought the barrels here after, Hale muttered, clean-up, containment. But as he studied the floor, the black stains soaked into the concrete, the dark splatter on the walls, he knew it hadn't just been storage. Something had happened in that room. Something violent. Further down the hall, they found a door ajar. Inside were medical cots arranged in neat rows. Rusted floor stands leaned beside them, tubing still dangling. The smell of ammonia and decay lingered. Cassandra stepped forward, her hand shaking. This is where they brought them. Hale glanced at her. Brought who? She turned, her eyes glistening. The Rourkes. Calder. Delara. The kids. You don't see it? This wasn't a waste dump. It was a lab. They were test subjects. The words landed like a hammer. Hale's stomach churned. He saw it now. The layout, the instruments, the observation mirrors. It wasn't a facility. It was an operating theater for human suffering. On the far wall, a chalkboard still bore faint writing. Phase 3. Neurological response. Cassandra stumbled backward, hand over her mouth. Oh my God, they tortured them. Hale grabbed her shoulders, steadying her. Listen to me. We can't fall apart now. We document everything. Photos, notes, anything we can carry out. But before he could move, a noise echoed to the corridor. The slam of a heavy door, followed by the sharp rhythm of boots on concrete. They ducked into a storage room, pressing themselves into shadows. Hale switched off the flashlight. Through the crack in the door, he saw them. 2 soldiers in unmarked fatigues, rifles slung over their shoulders. Colonel wants the samples moved tonight. One muttered. Why the rush? The other replied. Because the detective's still alive. Orders are orders. Hale's chest tightened. Draeger knew. He always knew. The guards passed. their footsteps fading into the maze of hallways. Hale waited until silence returned before pulling Cassandra out. "We don't have much time," he whispered. They reached what looked like the administrative wing. Filing cabinets overturned, desks coated in dust. Hale rifled through drawers until he struck gold, a folder stamped with the Winterthorn insignia. Inside were photographs, aerial shots of rural Montana, marked with circles. Each one corresponded to small settlements, cabins, or farms. The Rourke's land was among them, circled in red. But it wasn't the only one. Cassandra's hands shook as she flipped through. "These are families, dozens of them, all chosen, and all gone," Hale said grimly. At the back of the folder was a single document, not a report, but a memo signed in Drager's precise hand. "Proceed with Phase 4. Eliminate residuals. Ensure no witnesses." Residuals. That word stuck in Hale's throat like a splinter. Cassandra. Himself. Anyone who knew. A sudden bang reverberated through the building. Shouting followed, boots pounding closer. Hale shoved the folder into his coat and grabbed Cassandra's hand. "Move!" They sprinted down the corridor, lungs burning, until they burst through a service exit into the night. Floodlights flared behind them, cutting through the forest. Bullets cracked through the trees. Hale dragged Cassandra into the underbrush, the two of them crawling through mud and pine needles as shouts echoed. "Search the treeline." They didn't stop until their muscles screamed. Only when the facility was a distant silhouette behind them did Hale allow them to breathe. Cassandra clutched his arm, tears streaking her face, but her voice was steady. "You saw those files, Rowan. This isn't just about the Rourkes. It's bigger, so much bigger." Hale nodded grimly, his breath ragged. "And Drager will burn the world before he lets it come out." From the shadows, an owl called again. But this time it wasn't mournful. It was a warning. Somewhere in those woods, Drager's men were still hunting. And Hale knew they weren't going to stop. Not until every witness, every survivor, was gone. The forest at night felt alive. Every shadow twitched, every branch grown like bone under strain. Hale and Cassandra stumbled through undergrowth slick with dew, the beams of distant searchlights still slashing through the trees behind them. Neither spoke. Breaths came ragged, shallow, the kind of breathing that wasn't just exhaustion but terror clamped onto the lungs. Finally, when their bodies could carry them no further, Hale yanked Cassandra down behind a fallen pine. Its roots, gnarled and blackened with rot, rose like skeletal fingers, creating a small hollow. They crouched there, pressed together, listening. Shouts carried through the woods. "Boots! Dogs! The rhythm of the hunt," Cassandra whispered. "They won't stop, will they?" Hale didn't answer right away. His revolver rested heavy in his palm, the cold steel like an anchor. He thought about the files in his coat, the red circles over homesteads, the word residuals. It was no longer a theory. Drager had built his empire on blood and poison, and anyone who saw the truth was already marked for death. "No," Hale said finally, his voice a low growl. "They won't." Hours passed in fractured silences. They moved only when the search parties shifted, crawling belly first through ferns and bramble. Hale's senses sharpened with fatigue. The metallic taste of blood in his mouth, the throb in his temples, the way every insect's buzz seemed like a signal. At dawn, they reached a creek. The water rushed cold and fast over rocks, masking their scent from dogs. Cassandra dipped her trembling hands into it, splashing her face, drinking greedily. Her lips were cracked, her eyes rimmed with red. She looked up at him. "Rowan, what if we don't make it?" Hale crouched, scanning the treeline. "Then Drager wins. And the Rourkes, they're buried all over again. I won't let that happen." Her gaze softened, though fear never left her eyes. "Why are you still here? You could walk away. Burn the files. Start over. No one would blame you." Hale's jaw tightened. He thought of Jonas, the sick boy whose life ended in agony. He thought of Alara, her body hid like refuse beneath her own home. He thought of Cassandra, who had carried grief like a shackle for 11 years. "I can't," he said simply. They followed the creek until the rain opened into a valley. Smoke curled above treetops in the distance. A ranger station. Hale realized. Civilization. Safety. But before relief could root, a voice cut through the morning air. Detective Hale. It carried clearly, amplified by a bullhorn. The sound came from a ridge behind them. Hale spun, rifle raised. Cassandra froze, clutching his arm. On the ridge stood Colonel Magnus Drager. His uniform was gone, replaced with a heavy coat and combat boots. But the way he carried himself, upright, predatory, spoke of a man who never shed command. Flanking him were Creel and Kellen, their rifles trained downslope. Behind them, half a dozen soldiers fan out like wolves. Hale pulled Cassandra down into cover. Bullets tore bark from the fallen tree as Drager's voice echoed again. You think you're clever, Hale. Sneaking into my house, stealing my records. You're not the first to try. You won't be the last. His tone was calm, almost conversational, as though addressing a subordinate. But you, Drager continued, you've been persistent, and persistence must be rewarded. Cassandra trembled beside Hale. He's toying with us. Hale steadied his rifle, eyes locked on the ridge. That's what predators do. The next minutes blurred into violence. Gunfire cracked through the trees. Hale fired back, each shot forcing the soldiers into cover, but drawing their attention tighter. Cassandra crawled low, clutching the folder against her chest as though it were a lifeline. A grenade arced overhead, landing in the creek with a muted splash. The explosion sent a geyser of water and rock into the air, knocking Hale flat. His ears rang, vision swimming. Through the haze, he saw Drager descending the ridge, calm amid the chaos, like a wolf strolling into its kill. When Hale's vision cleared, Drager stood 10 yards away. Creel and Kellen flanked him, rifles at the ready. Hale tried to lift his revolver, but a boot pressed down on his hand. Drager leaned close, his shadow swallowing Hale's vision. You should have stayed in Helena, detective, Drager murmured. His eyes were pale, ice over steel. You should have signed your reports and gone home. But you had to dig, always digging. He pressed harder on Hale's wrist until the revolver clattered into the dirt. You want the truth? I'll give you the truth. Calder Rourke wasn't murdered because of some accident. He wasn't a victim. He was an asset. He knew the land. He knew the water. We needed him to test the contamination. His family. Drager's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. They were variables. Cassandra let out a strangled cry, clutching the folder to her chest. Drager turned his gaze on her. And you, Miss Vale, always writing, always asking questions. I should have silenced you in 94. Instead, I let grief do my work. A mistake I intend correct. He raised his pistol, leveling it at her forehead. Time fractured. Hale surged upward, slamming his shoulder into Drager's knee. The shot went wide, tearing bark from a tree. Creel lunged forward, rifle but swinging, but Hale caught him in the gut with a desperate punch. Cassandra bolted into the trees, clutching the folder. Run, Hale shouted, though his lungs burned, though blood trickled from his temple. He turned back just in time to see Drager recovering, his pistol steady once more. But instead of firing, Drager lowered it. His eyes followed Cassandra disappearing into the forest, and for the first time, Hale saw something dangerous in that pale gaze. Not rage, not fear, but amusement. She'll lead us to the others, Drager said calmly. Residuals always do. Hale froze. Others? But before he could demand answers, a rifle stock smashed across his jaw. Darkness swallowed him whole. When Hale woke, he was bound inside a truck, wrists tied with military cord. The engine growled beneath him. Through the barred window, he saw the trees of the Bitterroot sliding past, sun sinking behind them. Across from him sat Colonel Drager, silent, hands folded like a man in prayer. Hale's voice was raw when he finally spoke. You think you've won. Drager's pale eyes lifted, calm and cold. Detective, this isn't about winning. It's about control. And control, once lost, can never be regained. That's why the Rourkes had to die. That's why you will, too. Outside, the mountains swallowed the road. Night approached, and with it, the end game. But somewhere out there, Cassandra still ran. And Draeger wasn't chasing to kill her immediately. He wanted something more. Something Hale hadn't yet understood. The truck jostled over gravel roads, winding endlessly into the Bitterroot. Hale's wrists burned from cords binding them, every bump grinding rope into raw skin. Across from him, Colonel Draeger sat perfectly still, pale eyes reflecting the fading light. No threats, no boasts, just silence. It was the silence of a predator who knew the trap was already sprung. Hale forced himself to focus. Cassandra was still out there, running, hiding, carrying the only evidence that could break Draeger's empire. If she was alone in these woods, she wouldn't last long. Draeger didn't need to chase her. His men would track her like hounds. And the colonel? He had something else planned. Hale could feel it. The truck finally lurched to a stop. Soldiers dragged Hale into the open. The air smelled different, sharper, chemical. He blinked against floodlights that revealed a barren clearing, ringed with rusting barrels and collapsed fencing. Winter thorn, the poison heart of it all. The clearing was worse than Hale had imagined. Barrels oozed black sludge into the soil, the stench of solvents burning his lungs. Pools of stagnant water shimmered with rainbow sheens. A place where nothing could live for long. They forced him to his knees before Draeger, who stood on a rise overlooking the site. Creel and Kellen flanked him, rifles ready. "This," Draeger said, gesturing to the wasteland, "is what built my career, what bought senators, what paved my way to power. And no one will ever know. Not you, not Vale, not the ghost of the Rourkes." He crouched in front of Hale, lowering his voice. "Do you want to know what became of Calder?" Hale clenched his jaw. Draeger's eyes gleamed. He didn't stumble on the barrels by accident. We led him here. Watched as he discovered the truth. Watched as the sickness took his boy. Calder was leverage. Proof contamination could spread. He was supposed to keep quiet. But he wouldn't. He had to fight. Draeger's mouth curled. So we used him, tested how far he'd go. And when he broke, we broke him completely. The words slithered into Hale's gut like ice. Calder hadn't been silenced instantly. He'd been toyed with, used until his resistance made him dangerous, then discarded. And Alara? Hale forced out. Draeger straightened, tone dismissive. Collateral, as were the children. Variables removed from the equation. Somewhere in the trees, Cassandra Vale crouched low, watching through brush. She had followed the convoy here, heart hammering as she realized where they brought Hale. Winter thorn. The file pressed against her chest now felt heavier than stone. Inside were manifest signatures, contracts, all enough to burn Draeger's empire. But evidence meant nothing if she didn't survive. She wiped trembling hands on her jeans, then slid along the tree lean. Her eyes caught on a shack near the clearing. Its roof sagged, walls rotting. But inside, she glimpsed something pale in a soldier's flashlight. Bones, half buried, tangled in remnants of fabric. Cassandra's breath caught. A child's dress. A small boot. The Rourke children. Her stomach twisted, but grief hardened into resolve. This was where they had been discarded. She couldn't let Hale join them. In the clearing, Draeger motioned for soldiers to bring Hale to the shack. "You'll join the Rourkes." Forgotten. Another variable removed. They dragged Hale forward, boots scraping dirt. His mind raced. Not with fear, but with fury that Draeger's empire might survive. Then gunfire. Sharp, frantic. One of Draeger's men dropped. Blood spraying across a barrel. Another spun, firing blindly into the trees. Chaos erupted. Cassandra had pulled Hale's revolver from his coat before fleeing the cabin. Now she fired again, each shot a lightning crack through the night. Not accurate, not precise, but enough. Enough to fracture Draeger's perfect control. Hale tore free, slamming his shoulder into Creel, wrenching the man's rifle. He fired, recoil jolting him. Creel dropped. Kellen dove for cover. Draeger remained motionless, pale eyes scanning the tree lean, until they locked on Cassandra. Recognition flickered, then amusement. "Of course," he murmured. "The residual." Floodlights swung wildly. Cassandra dashed from cover. Firing again, driving soldiers back. Hale met her halfway, pulling her behind rusted debris. "You shouldn't have come," Hale rasped, reloading. "And leave you," Cassandra snapped. Her eyes were wet, her breath uneven, but her grip was steady. Not after what they did. For a moment, silence pressed in. Then Drager's voice boomed across the clearing, calm and terrifying. "You think this ends tonight? Even if you kill me, others will rise. Winterthorn is bigger than one man. It's a legacy." He descended the rise, pistol drawn, silhouette massive against the lights. Soldiers regrouped behind him, but held back. Hale rose from cover, rifle raised. Legacies die with their architects. The final clash was brutal, raw. Bullets tore through the clearing, sparks flying from barrels. Cassandra darted between cover, shoving the file into Hale's satchel as he laid down fire. Soldiers fell one by one, but not without cost. Hale's shoulder burned from a grazing shot. Cassandra's cheek split from shrapnel. Then only Drager remained. He stood near the shack, pistol trained on Cassandra. Behind him, the earth sloped into the poisoned mire where barrels leak venom. "Drop it," Drager commanded. Cassandra froze. The revolver felt heavy. Hale moved, but Drager's aim shifted instantly. One step closer and she dies. Floodlights buzzed. Solvents clawed their throats. Then Cassandra spoke, voice trembling but defiant. "You killed them all, but you can't bury the truth forever. Someone will dig it up." Drager's expression barely shifted. "Then I'll kill them too." His finger tightened on the trigger. Hale lunged. The shot cracked. Cassandra fell back, stunned but alive, the bullet grazing her ear. Hale crashed into Drager, both men tumbling into the poisoned mire. The water hissed where it touched skin. They grappled, choking. Drager's grip crushed Hale's throat, but Hale forced the rifle beneath his jaw. "Legacy ends now," he rasped. The blast lit the clearing like lightning. Drager convulsed, then went limp, sinking into the mire. The aftermath was silent, but for Cassandra's ragged sobs. She dragged Hale from the sludge. His face was burned, shoulders shredded, but his eyes still burned with defiance. Together, they staggered from Winterthorn, the folder clutched between them. Behind them, the clearing smoldered, Drager gone, but the bones of the Rourke children finally unearthed. Weeks later, headlines screamed, "Winterthorn exposed, military waste scandal tied to Cold War cover-up. 3 high-ranking officers indicted. Bitterroot poisoning linked to murder of Rourke family." But Hale and Cassandra didn't linger to read. They stood on a ridge above the valley, the wind cold, the pines whispering. "This isn't peace," Cassandra murmured. "No," Hale agreed, "but it's truth." Below, the Bitterroot stretched endless. The wilderness had never been the true killer. It had been men, greed, secrecy, power. And now at least their ghosts had names. As they turned to leave, Cassandra glanced back one last time. The pines swayed, shadows deepening. Somewhere in the rustle of branches, she thought she heard children's laughter. Not haunting, not grieving. Free,